The ring that should never have returned. The house felt different once Eleanor stepped out of the study. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of silence that presses against the ears until a person starts hearing their own heartbeat. Eleanor paused at the end of the corridor, her palm resting lightly against the cool stone wall. She hadn't planned to confront anyone that morning. She had only wanted confirmation, reassurance that the unease she felt was nothing more than imagination. But now the image of that ring burned behind her eyes. Emerald. Old-cut diamonds. A setting designed not to flatter, but to declare. She had seen it before. She knew she had. The estate's west wing was still quiet, most of the household preparing for the day's engagements. Eleanor moved instinctively toward the long gallery, her footsteps soft against the rugs. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, dust motes dancing lazily in the air as if the building itself were pretending nothing had changed. But something had changed. And once symbols shift, institutions follow. A memory awakened. Later that morning, Eleanor found herself alone in the archival reading room. The room wasn't officially restricted, but few ventured there without purpose. Rows of leather-bound volumes lined the walls, each containing fragments of decisions made long before any of them were born. Power, she knew, was rarely loud. It preferred whispers. She pulled one volume after another, not searching randomly now but following instinct. Her fingers stopped on a book she hadn't opened in years, Private Adornments of the Sovereign Line. The moment she opened it, her breath caught. There it was. Not the same photograph, older, grainier, but unmistakable. The emerald ring. The caption beneath it was brief, almost dismissive, as if the author wished to hurry past it. Commissioned during a period of personal controversy. Later withdrawn from circulation due to symbolic sensitivity. Symbolic sensitivity. That was the phrase historians used when something carried too much truth. Eleanor closed the book slowly. If the ring had been withdrawn, if it had been sealed away to protect the institution from reminding the public of a moment when desire outweighed duty, then how had it returned? And why now? The woman who wore it. Lady Maribel had never been subtle. She didn't need to be. She had learned long ago that patience was more powerful than noise, and presence more persuasive than argument. When she entered a room, conversations didn't stop out of respect. They stopped out of recalculation. That afternoon, Eleanor saw her again. A small gathering. Nothing official. Just tea and muted conversation among those who lived close enough to power to feel its warmth without holding it. Maribel laughed softly as she spoke, one hand resting near her cup. The ring caught the light. Eleanor watched the reactions around the room. Averted eyes. Quick glances. Stiffened postures. People recognized the weight of that emerald even if they didn't know its story. Symbols don't require explanation. They speak to memory. And memory, Eleanor knew, was dangerous. A private question. She waited until the others drifted away. "May I ask you something?" Eleanor said carefully. Maribel smiled without surprise. "Of course." Eleanor gestured gently toward her hand. "The ring. It's remarkable." Maribel looked down at it as though noticing it for the first time. "Oh, this? A gift." Her tone was light. Too light. "It carries history," Eleanor said. "A complicated one." Maribel's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. All things worth having do. There it was. Not denial. Not explanation. Assertion. Eleanor understood then that this wasn't ignorance. It was intention. The man at the center. That evening, Lord Harrington sat alone in his study. He had dismissed everyone. He always did when the weight pressed too heavily against his chest. He told himself that the ring was his right to give. That history belonged to the victor, and that time softened meaning. But memory is stubborn. He hadn't expected Eleanor to notice so quickly. That unsettled him. Not because she was wrong, but because she was observant. And observant people didn't accept quiet revisions of the past. When a soft knock came at the door, his jaw tightened. "Enter." Eleanor stepped inside. She didn't sit. She didn't bow. She simply stood there, steady and composed, carrying something far heavier than accusation. Concern. The first fracture. "I won't take much of your time," she said. "That remains to be seen," he replied coolly. She met his gaze. "The ring should not be worn." Silence. The kind that doesn't ask for explanation, it dares challenge. "I decide what should be worn," he said. "And history decides what should be remembered," Eleanor answered quietly. That was the moment. The moment the air shifted. Not an argument. A collision. Two truths standing too close together to coexist peacefully. Lord Harrington rose slowly, his voice controlled but edged. You mistake symbolism for authority. No, Eleanor said. I understand symbolism is authority. His temper flared then, not loudly but sharply like a blade drawn too fast. That ring represents survival, he said. Choice. Love. It represents abandonment, Eleanor replied. And the cost of putting self before duty. The words landed. And once spoken they could not be reclaimed. The cost of being seen. The house did not erupt after Eleanor left the study. That was what unsettled her most. There were no raised voices echoing down the corridor. No slammed doors. No servants whispering urgently behind their hands. The building carried on as if nothing remarkable had happened. Tea trays moved on schedule, clocks chimed on the quarter hour, and sunlight continued to fall across the floors in long, indifferent streaks. But institutions rarely collapse with noise. They fracture in silence. A shift in the air. By the following morning, Eleanor felt it everywhere. Not hostility, something colder. Distance. Conversations ended sooner when she entered a room. Invitations were phrased more formally. Smiles lingered just a moment less than before. Even the household staff, unfailingly discreet, seemed careful not to meet her eyes. She had not been reprimanded. She had been repositioned. Eleanor understood the tactic well enough. Power rarely punished openly. It preferred to rearrange the world around you until you felt inconvenient rather than attacked. She stood at the tall window of her sitting room, watching the grounds awaken. The estate looked unchanged, but she knew better now. Once a symbol is introduced, everything must realign around it. And Maribel's ring was now that symbol. Maribel's composure. Maribel, for her part, appeared untroubled. At luncheon she was radiant, calm, amused, effortlessly gracious. The emerald ring gleamed against porcelain and silver as she gestured lightly, as though daring the room to acknowledge it. Eleanor studied her across the table. This was not a woman overwhelmed by guilt or uncertainty. This was a woman claiming space. Isn't it extraordinary, Maribel said lightly, how objects can take on such exaggerated meaning? Her gaze flicked just briefly toward Eleanor. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned that silence, when chosen deliberately, unsettles people far more than argument. Private consequences. Later that day, Eleanor's husband found her in the small music room, fingers resting idly on the edge of the piano. You shouldn't have confronted him, he said quietly. Not accusing. Not defending. Exhausted. I didn't plan to, Eleanor replied. But I couldn't pretend it meant nothing. He exhaled slowly. You know what this does to him. Yes, she said. And I know what ignoring it does to us. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the conflict behind his composure. He had been raised to smooth over fractures, not expose them. Maribel won't remove it, he said. I know. And he won't admit it was a mistake. I know that too. Then what was the point? Eleanor turned toward him. The point, she said, was that someone said out loud that symbols still matter. The ring becomes a message. Within days, whispers spread beyond the estate. Not gossip, recognition. The ring appeared in public settings. Quiet receptions, brief appearances, moments where photographs were inevitable but commentary was restrained. Observers noticed. They always do. And though no one spoke openly, questions formed, uncomfortable ones. Historians shifted uncomfortably. Advisors grew cautious. The past so carefully archived stirred. Eleanor read the subtle signs. Meetings postponed. Briefings revised. Statements softened. A symbol had re-entered circulation. And symbols never return without consequence. A private warning. One evening, Eleanor received a message. No signature, no explanation, requesting a meeting in one of the estate's unused sitting rooms. She went alone. Inside, the fire burned low. A single figure stood by the mantel. You've caused concern, said the voice. Eleanor recognized it at once. I've acknowledged reality, she replied. The figure turned. Reality is shaped by restraint. Restraint without conscience becomes silence, Eleanor said. And silence becomes complicity. Pause. You are placing yourself outside protection, the voice warned. Eleanor nodded once. I'm aware. Maribel will not yield. I'm aware. And he will not forgive. Eleanor met the speaker's gaze steadily. Then that tells me everything I need to know. The emotional cost. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. Not from fear, but from clarity. She understood now that this was never about jewelry. It was about what was permitted to be remembered. Maribel's ring was not an accident. It was a declaration that the past could be reframed, softened, reclaimed as romance rather than warning. And Eleanor had disrupted that narrative. By simply naming the truth. Maribel speaks. The confrontation came unexpectedly. A quiet corridor. No witnesses. I admire conviction, Maribel said, stopping beside her. Even when it's inconvenient. Eleanor met her eyes. Conviction isn't admiration worthy if it serves only oneself. Maribel smiled faintly. History favors those who endure. So does conscience, Eleanor replied. Maribel's fingers brushed the emerald ring. You see scandal, she said softly. I see survival. And I see cost, Eleanor answered. Paid by those who didn't get to choose. For the first time Maribel's smile wavered. Just slightly. When silence starts to scream. The first sign that control was slipping did not come from the public. It came from within. The household briefings grew longer. The language became cautious, curated to the point of strain. Words like heritage, continuity, and personal legacy appeared more frequently, as though repetition alone could smooth the sharp edges of the present. Eleanor noticed everything. She always had. When institutions begin to over-explain themselves, it means they are afraid someone is listening too closely. The unofficial story. No statement was ever released about the ring. There didn't need to be. Instead, an unofficial story circulated, never written down, never confirmed. A softer version of the past. A narrative carefully edited to sound inevitable rather than reckless. Well, perseverance. Vindication. The same words always used when history was being reshaped. Eleanor listened as advisors repeated it behind closed doors, testing its resilience. She did not interrupt. She understood that arguments rarely defeat narratives. Only truth does. Maribel's strategy. Maribel adapted effortlessly. She leaned into warmth, smiles held longer, gestures gentler. The ring remained, always visible but never emphasized. She spoke often of unity, of healing, of moving forward. But Eleanor recognized the technique. When power wants to escape accountability, it reframes itself as compassion. The moment that shifted everything. It happened during a modest public appearance, nothing ceremonial, nothing grand. A quiet visit. A simple exchange. And yet, one moment lingered. A young woman, polite, nervous, had glanced at the ring and hesitated before speaking. My grandmother used to tell stories about that time, she said carefully. About what was lost. The room froze. Maribel smiled kindly. Stories often exaggerate. Eleanor watched something flicker across several faces. Recognition. Memory had been triggered. And memory is dangerous. The consequences begin. The following days brought subtle fallout. Historians requested access to archives. Editors revised language. Invitations were delayed. The past, once sealed away, had begun pressing outward. Lord Harrington grew irritable. Not angry, unsettled. Power, when questioned quietly, reacts more violently than when attacked outright. He summoned Eleanor. The confrontation without shouting. You've made yourself difficult, he said. Eleanor stood calmly. I've made myself honest. You've undermined stability. I've protected meaning. He turned sharply. Meaning is what we decide it is. No, Eleanor said. Meaning is what survives us. Silence stretched. You could have stayed comfortable, he said. I could not, she replied. He looked at her then, not as an opponent but as something more unsettling. A reminder. Maribel's private fear. For the first time Maribel felt it. Not criticism. Exposure. She stared at the ring that night, turning it slowly in the lamplight. She had wanted recognition, not conflict. Vindication, not scrutiny. But symbols don't obey intention. They obey memory. And memory had begun speaking back. The choice. Eleanor sat alone later that evening, writing nothing, just thinking. She understood now that nothing dramatic would happen. No public apology. No confession. No removal of the ring. That wasn't how institutions changed. They changed when someone refused to forget. And Eleanor had done that. The weight no one sees. Power is loud only when it feels secure. When it begins to doubt itself, it retreats inward, growing heavy, irritable, and strangely fragile. Eleanor sensed that shift before anyone spoke of it. It was in the pauses. Those moments when conversation stalled not because there was nothing to say but because no one wanted to say the wrong thing anymore. The house grows careful. By now the estate had learned how to move around Eleanor. Not avoid her. Navigate her. Doors closed more softly. Meetings began without her name mentioned. Decisions were phrased as if they had always been inevitable, as though no alternative had ever existed. This was the cost of refusing silence. Not punishment. Erasure. And yet, Eleanor felt calmer than she had in weeks. She had crossed the point of fear. Once a person accepts exclusion, power loses its leverage. Maribel's private night. Maribel sat alone before the mirror, the room lit only by a single lamp. The emerald ring lay on the table in front of her. For the first time since receiving it, she had taken it off. She studied it now, not as a symbol of triumph but as an object with a history too heavy to wear forever. She remembered the moment it was placed in her hand. Not romance. Relief. Validation. A quiet assurance that the years of waiting, of being judged, of standing just outside legitimacy, had finally been redeemed. Or so she had believed. But redemption borrowed from the past always demands interest. And that interest had arrived in Eleanor's voice. The crack in the armor. Maribel hadn't expected Eleanor to be steady. She had expected anger. Or ambition. Or moral grandstanding. What unsettled her was restraint. Eleanor hadn't sought allies. Hadn't leaked information. Hadn't escalated. She had simply remembered. And memory is more powerful than outrage. Maribel closed her eyes. For the first time, doubt whispered. What if the ring doesn't prove survival, but repetition? The man who could not apologize. Lord Harrington felt the pressure too. He told himself that resistance would fade. That institutions always outlast discomfort. But discomfort had a way of accumulating. He found himself irritated by minor things, misplaced papers, delayed replies, neutral expressions that once would have been warm. Eleanor's presence lingered even when she wasn't there. Not defiant. Disappointing. And disappointment, to someone who believed he had endured everything, felt like betrayal. The final private meeting. The summons came quietly. No formal language. No witnesses. Just a request. Eleanor entered the study knowing what it was. Not a confrontation. A reckoning. I won't ask you to apologize, he said without preamble. I wouldn't offer one, Eleanor replied gently. You've created a fracture, he said. I revealed one, she answered. He turned toward her slowly. History requires compromise. Conscience requires clarity, Eleanor said. A long silence followed. You will not be thanked for this, he said at last. I didn't expect gratitude, she replied. Only honesty. Maribel's decision. That night, Maribel replaced the ring, not on her finger but in a velvet-lined box. She did not announce it. She did not explain. She simply stopped wearing it. Some noticed immediately. Others pretended not to. But symbols don't vanish quietly. Their absence speaks too. The quiet aftermath. No statement was issued. No acknowledgement made. The ring did not reappear. And Eleanor was never mentioned in connection with it. Which was precisely the point. History would smooth the edges. But not erase the truth. Because somewhere in the archive of memory, not books but people, the story had been registered. Eleanor's stillness. Eleanor walked the grounds at dawn, the air cool and clear. She felt no triumph. Only relief. She had not changed the institution. She had reminded it. And sometimes that is enough. What remains when symbols fade? Time did what it always does. It moved forward. And with it, the house returned to its rhythms. Engagements resumed, schedules stabilized, and the careful choreography of public life regained its familiar shape. To an outside observer, nothing appeared altered. But institutions are not changed by appearances. They are changed by what they can no longer undo. The ring in absence. No announcement was ever made. No explanation offered. The emerald ring simply vanished from view. Some said it had been placed back into the archives. Others claimed it was never meant to be worn publicly at all. A few whispered that it had been quietly retired, deemed too easily misunderstood. But the truth was simpler. It had become too clearly understood. And so it disappeared. Absence, Eleanor knew, was its own kind of admission. Maribel's silence. Maribel adjusted seamlessly. She always had. She appeared softer now, less declarative, more cautious. Her gestures remained elegant, her smile still practiced, but something vital had shifted. Confidence had given way to calculation. She never spoke of the ring again. But Eleanor noticed something else. Maribel avoided mirrors. And that told her more than any confession ever could. The man and his legacy. Lord Harrington did not mention the incident again. Not to Eleanor. Not to Maribel. Not to anyone. But his decisions changed. Subtly. He consulted historians more often. Deferred when he once would have insisted. chose language with greater care. He never apologized. He never needed to. The quiet recalibration was acknowledgement enough. Power does not admit error aloud. It adapts in silence. Eleanor's position. Eleanor did not regain what she lost. She remained on the margins of decision-making, her influence unofficial, her presence carefully managed. But she did not seek restoration. She had not spoken to be welcomed. She had spoken to be true. And that truth had taken root. In glances exchanged. In words unsaid. In decisions reconsidered. A conversation years later. It happened long after the tension had cooled. A young woman, new, earnest, observant, approached Eleanor after a quiet engagement. "I've been reading," she said hesitantly, "about symbols, about how history repeats itself." Eleanor smiled gently. "And what did you learn?" "That silence isn't neutrality," the woman said. "It's permission." Eleanor felt something settle in her chest. "Yes," she said softly. "That's exactly right. The true legacy. The ring would be catalogued. The moment would fade. Names would be forgotten. But the lesson would remain. That someone noticed. That someone spoke. That someone refused comfort in exchange for conscience. And that was enough. Because institutions do not endure because they are flawless. They endure because sometimes someone reminds them who they were meant to be." Eleanor at dawn. On a quiet morning, Eleanor walked the grounds once more. The air was cool. The world unremarkable. She felt no regret. Only peace. She had not won. She had not lost. She had stood. And standing, she had learned, was sometimes the most radical act of all.